afternoon. It's really a privilege to be here, and I have to say, I mean, I've met some great people. You know, the Human Capital Summit has been just first class all the way, so it's been a privilege to be here. And I'll have to say, just in terms of my career, I've worked in the area of leadership for 25 years, pretty much my whole career, even in graduate school. And I can't think of a better way to be able to influence the future than to be able to help build leaders who are, you know, having that kind of ripple effect that we talked about. But most of all right now, I'm feeling really grateful and privileged that handcrafted cocktails are only 90 minutes away. So I'm looking forward to talking with you all then. So what I'm here to talk with you about today is top companies for leaders. And so what we're going to talk about is what this research is all about. I don't know if you are aware, but Aon acquired Hewitt a number of years ago. And I think one of the things that was most exciting for me about that acquisition is this longitudinal, just phenomenal research study on leadership. And so I'll ground you a little bit in the context of that study and what differentiates at a high level those companies who are really top at developing leaders. We don't have the time to talk about all the findings. I mean, it's really a gold mine of information. I do encourage you to go out to our website or stop by our booth and get a copy of the highlights report. It's full of great information. But I am going to take a deep dive today on assessment, leadership assessment, one of the foundational practices, and you've heard a little bit about it. And so we'll get a little more specific into what are some of the guiding principles, things that we see at top companies for leaders, things that the research demonstrates really makes the difference in organizations that are doing it well. So, top companies for leader, what's it all about? So first of all, it's the longest running, most comprehensive study about leadership of its kind. It's been going on, this is the 8th iteration, it's been going on since 2001. And from the first study on, it made the linkages between financial results that organizations were having and their leadership practices. More specifically, we've been, over the years, been able to really tease out some of those practices using the actual data to determine what makes the difference, what is it at those organizations. And we're really looking at leadership holistically. In fact, in many ways, it's about talent management as much as it is about leadership, because in many ways, as we've heard throughout the day, everyone has the potential to be a leader in some way, shape, or form. So in terms of the methodology, it's a rigorous process. I'm, again, really pleased to have been part of the Top Companies for Leaders team that has done the study in the last couple of iterations. And the first step in the process is that organizations apply and they fill out a pretty extensive survey, not atypical for this kind of a process. And by the way, I'd encourage any of you, in the next time we do this, to consider at least doing the survey. Many organizations, do it not because they think they're going to win, but they want to use it as the opportunity to self-assess. So we end up with over like 1,500 data points on these organizations. That's used to screen them down to finalists. Finalists then go through extensive interviews, and that's kind of where I got to come in. And we do at least 4 interviews with each of the finalist organizations. And in fact, for 70% of the finalist organizations, we were able to talk to their CEO. And that's a critical process. I think it's one of the things that differentiates us from a lot of survey-based studies, is that we really get in there and see if organizations are truly walking the talk. And I'll share some examples of that in a minute. The next step is that we check their financials. Organizations to be considered top companies have to have scored at the high end compared to their industry from a financial performance standpoint. And then we also do a press screen, for 18 months, have there been any, ethical violations that would rule them out in terms of being the kind of company that we'd really want to be representing leadership. Then last but not least, it's not Aon Hewitt who selects the winners. It's a very unbiased process in that we've got panels of judges that meet in different parts of the world. This is a global study. And the judges are comprised of very prestigious leadership experts from places like Wharton. I know Wharton's represented here today, from Harvard, well-known business schools and experts in the field of leadership. So in 2014, we had 24 countries represented. We had 115 finalists. And again, so we got a lot of information. I know this is probably too small a type to read, but I couldn't help but at least give a little bit of visibility. So we have a list of top 25 global winners, and then we have North America winners. We also have Asia, India, Australia, smaller lists of winners. But in this context, I thought it would be useful to share the global winners and the North America winners. So with the rest of the information that I'll be sharing with you today, you can think about it as these top companies compared to all the rest of the companies that applied. And so when you look at this data, keep in mind that the bar is really quite high. I mean, top companies are the cream of the crop, but even the other companies, there's some who are applying just for the benefit of the learning, but they're certainly not slouches. There are organizations I interviewed that didn't make the list that have just some remarkable leadership practices. So over the years, we've found there are certain things that differentiate top companies. And again, we keep building on that knowledge every year. But overall, it boils down to 4 disciplines, which I'll share with you, 5 fundamentals, things that organizations put in place. And then this year, one of the things that really started to surface is that there are 3 kinds of leadership characteristics, or what we'd call DNA, that are really reflecting the workplace that we're living in today. And no, that doesn't add up to 25, but that's our semi-humorous way of saying that this adds up to more than just the parts. So what differentiates top companies? So let's start at the highest level, the most broad level. There are 4 disciplines, and these are the things that have just stuck with us for years and years. The first is that top companies have leaders who lead the way. And I couldn't help but thinking when we heard David Novak speaking this morning, he talked about teaching leadership classes. That would be typical of the kinds of behaviors we would see at top companies. In fact, I need to encourage them to apply for this award. It's a palpable, passionate commitment to developing leaders. There's also this intense focus on talent at every level in the organization. And just by way of example, some of the organizations I interviewed talked about how the financial results would be talked about, but the talent reports would be right behind that. So imagine if at your organization, talent metrics were looked at just as frequently as financial metrics. I think that's very, very telling. The leadership strategy reflects the business strategy. I think that's kind of a no-brainer, but the companies at the top really have fine-tuned that and determined, what it's going to take in terms of the capabilities, the characteristics to carry out their leadership strategy, not just in the short term, but over the longer-term strategy that they've put in place. And then this 4th discipline really kind of emerges. It's not the kind of thing that you do right out of the box. It's a matter of doing things consistently, well over time, really institutionalizing some of these practices. So you've got to kind of get 1, 2, and 3 right over an extended period of time in order to really get that 4th one in place. So some of the 5 fundamentals that we see in organizations, and again, this overlaps a little bit, but again, you see the CEOs and the board heavily involved, not just frontline managers or mid-level managers. It really goes all the way up to the top. Again, I think David Novak was a good example of this. Another winner of TCFL, Fluor, they're a company who builds large buildings, and it was very telling to me when I interviewed the CEO, and he said, my job is not to build buildings. My job is to build leaders, and it's those leaders who will take care of the customers and build the buildings. Another thing that was really interesting is that they're okay with the fact that some of their leaders are going to leave. They know they're building great leaders, they're going to be attractive. Many of those leaders go on to become clients and customers, so they really understand the long-term benefits of doing this. Again, I mentioned the alignment. There's this pervasive focus on talent, and you'll see that in some of the practices. One specifically that we'll talk about, the leadership assessment practices. And there's just this mindset around leadership that people walk it and talk it and they measure it. They can see the results, they're tracking the metrics, and in this day and age of big data, it's a lot easier to do some of that. And one of the things we'll also talk about is technology and how technology can really facilitate some of that as well. So the DNA, I mentioned that this is one of the things that started to emerge in this study. And I don't think you'll probably find it surprising, but maybe something you haven't thought about just this way. I'm assuming most of you have heard of VUCA. Everybody here heard of VUCA? few people. I'll admit, I hadn't heard the term VUCA until about 2 years ago at a conference. Like, VUCA, what is that? That doesn't sound all that pleasant, VUCA. But that stands for volatile, now I'm going to forget it myself, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I think most of us would say that defines the workplace we live in today. I mean, if you're expecting something to be the same from day to day, I think we've all realized that you've got to be pretty adaptable to survive. And so we saw that reflected in our research study. One thing in particular is self-awareness, and I know that's come up in some of the other presentations today. But leaders need to be self-aware. They need to be very tuned in to what their strengths are, what their development opportunities, and how they're perceived by others. So self-awareness was a prominent theme. A second theme was resilience, being able to really bounce back, pick yourself up, and be able to go on, to be able to learn from failures. We all know that learning takes experience, and some of those experiences may mean, falling down. And so the key is being able to pick yourself back up. And then the last one, again, relates to something you heard from some of the other speakers, is engaging leadership. Another thing that David mentioned was that in the past, leadership may have meant, being able to be kind of emotionally detached and, able to make good decisions. But what we've seen in the last 2 iterations of the study is that effective leadership really is more about building emotional connections than ever before. We work virtually, things are constantly changing, and so we need to feel, trust and a strong sense of emotional attachment to the organization and to the leaders that we work with. And so leaders who are able to do that, to engage their workforce, are those that are most successful. So those are some of the characteristics of the DNA, but what happens in terms of creating that is that there have to be strong organizational practices in place. And one of those, of course, is leadership assessment, and that's what we're going to spend most of our time here today talking about. So what can we learn about doing assessment effectively from what top companies do? Well, first of all, they've got a discipline around it. They're using assessment to make selection decisions. They're using assessment to identify high potentials. By the way, potentials I always think is kind of an interesting concept, and I know it was talked about during the post-lunch keynote as well. Potential is really, the first question I ask is potential for what? That's always the question when you're talking about high potential, is high potential for what? And then again, if you're not a high potential, what does that make you? Somebody gave me an answer at another conference I was at. That makes you a popo. Anybody heard of a popo? Passed over and pissed off. Hopefully that won't get bleeped from the recording here. Passed over and pissed off. So you don't want popos in your organization. I mean, everybody contributes, everybody adds value, and so you want everyone to have the chance to learn and develop. It's the equity versus equality concept we heard about. They use assessment information to drive strategic interventions, to create those development plans, to really accelerate development. Methods that accelerate development is really kind of one of the hot trends that I'm seeing. And then, of course, to predict. Again, when you're looking at assessment over large groups of people, you can use that information to determine how ready your organization will be to meet the needs of the future. So some stats, and I'll try to keep these simple and not kind of overwhelm you with numbers. But again, this study is very data-driven. And so top companies for leaders, 100% of top companies have formal strategies for assessing leaders. They're using assessment to develop or identify deficiencies and to create development plans to build on those. So again, as I think we heard a little bit earlier, assessment is useful for developing people's strengths. One of the things that I have been struck by most in terms of doing coaching with lots of very impressive leaders over the years is that when they get assessment data, one of the first things they do is look for the deficiencies. And so there's a good thing to that. They're very self-aware and they want to focus on what they can improve upon. I know one of the speakers talked about assessment that's negative and process focused as being very valuable. So we sometimes have to point out, you've got to leverage your strengths in addition to making sure that your weaknesses don't derail you, but there's got to be a focus on both. I love these findings. My background is that I'm an industrial psychologist, so I've, again, spent most of my career studying leadership development, leadership assessment. But it's maybe not surprising that organizations and the top companies who were using assessment for the C-suite had 15% when they're using assessment at senior level positions. But what I loved seeing this year was that those organizations that are using assessment at mid-levels had a 35% higher relative profitability. So it's that mid-level, making sure that assessment and leadership development is permeating throughout the organization that really made the big difference. And it's that kind of uncommon common sense that if you don't fill your pipeline and begin developing that pipeline early, you're not going to have those people at the top. So critical difference. Several bar charts here, and in this case, the yellow is the senior leadership, the mid-level is the green, and then frontline is the gray. So again, one of the things that was really prevalent at top companies is that they're not just using assessment for one level, they're using it throughout the organization at multiple levels. So I've tried to boil down all this information about top companies, as well as some of the scientific literature, into some principles that I hope will be relatively easy for you to take away, stick with you. Again, they may be simple in terms of writing them down, not necessarily always that simple to put into practice. But one of the first principles, and this again relates to assessing at all levels, is this idea of assessing the capability to make the curve. So when we talk about assessing high potential, I think one of the questions to ask is potential for what level? And again, someone else had cited the Sharon, pretty classic work on the leadership pipeline model, and I've got to give credit to this model to them. But every time someone makes a new curve in the pipeline, there may be some differences in skills that they need to develop. In fact, this graphic, it's kind of funny because when we were getting ready for the conference, graphic designer took the model and they weren't crazy about it, so they reconfigured it and they made it a very linear model. And I said, no, you're missing the point here. The point is that it's not just linear. If you just keep doing what you've always done, you may derail. Because, for example, I think the best example is you think about an individual contributor. They're successful by being a great individual performer. Maybe they help their team members and so forth, but they get the job done. If they persist in doing that when they move into a supervisory role, they're probably going to derail because that's a major shift in terms of learning to get things done through others versus doing it all yourself. So each of those points in the pipeline, and there was a similar model put up in the post-lunch keynote, each step in that pipeline has some different requirements. So important, if you aren't familiar with that book, I encourage you to get it. Again, leadership assessment isn't one size fits all, but at least it will give you some clues in terms of the kinds of capabilities that are going to be most important at different levels. So the second guiding principle is about aligning your assessment processes with the organizational strategy and with the context. In some ways that may seem like a no-brainer, but there was an article, a McKinsey article, just 2014, so very recent, where one of the 4 reasons leadership development programs fail is failing to take into account context. Again, it's some of that uncommon common sense that you've got to match the capabilities required and how you're assessing those capabilities with the skills that are needed for the organization to achieve its specific challenges. So again, top companies, you can see a much higher percentage, 88% versus all others, are explicitly aligning their assessment with the organizational strategy. So a good example of that would be is if an organization is really moving toward a global footprint, then obviously to be successful, they're probably going to need to start focusing on measuring global mindset or cultural adaptability and agility. So different things are going to be differentially important at organizations. Now that's not to say there aren't some common themes. It doesn't mean you have to have a custom assessment process for every situation. But if you fail to take into account those unique organizational challenges, you're probably going to miss some things. Put my notes here. Oops, I went backwards. So the third guiding principle is to use multiple techniques. And again, many organizations use assessments. But like leadership, assessment is more effective if it's multidimensional. So using one particular tool may give you one viewpoint of a leader, and using another assessment tool may give you a different viewpoint. So you can see that top companies, again, are using a variety of tools, 360 feedback, competency-based, more behavioral kinds of assessment tools, personality assessments, cognitive assessments. And it makes sense that if you want a leader who's well-rounded, you need to look at them from all perspectives. So assessment techniques are not all created valid. And one of the things that we've known since the late 1950s, since this is not a new trend, is that assessment centers are particularly powerful. And by assessment center, I mean a process where you're bringing together multiple assessment tools. Assessment center isn't necessarily a place. It's a process of bringing different tools together and combining that information. So with assessment, it's truly the case that you're going to get better information if you look at multiple sources of information. And by combining that information, when you're giving feedback to participants in the process, it gets to be harder and harder to sort of overlook certain things. If you're getting consistent messages, your peers said this in the feedback, your personality profile is suggesting this is your style. The role plays or the simulations that you participated in, you demonstrated this consistent behavior. So I think it's when you combine those things, you really get the more accurate information. You start to see the themes, and then the flip side is that you have better information for giving feedback. And we've heard again today how important feedback is. So this chart that you see is, this is one that's based more on the literature, and we looked at a lot of different meta-analytic studies and things that are in the referee journals. And these are some general, guidelines in terms of the validity of assessment tools. Each one is going to be different. You have to kind of look at each tool for itself. I know if your email box is like mine, you probably wake up and have assessment tools that you're getting advertisements about all the time. So it's very important to really be selective. I mentioned using a number of processes important, quality of those processes is equally important. I mean, when you think about the critical decisions that you're making for your organization, when you're selecting and you're choosing who to invest in, you want those decisions to be accurate. I don't know how many of you know this, but an unstructured interview is about the same level of accuracy as flipping a coin. Some of you probably are aware of that. That's, I don't know that I'd want to be placing my bets on that for selecting the leaders of my company. Now, obviously, when you structure interviews, they can be much more powerful. And if you combine these things, while there may be some overlap across the techniques, you're going to have an additive effect. It's called incremental validity across the different tools. So what this measures is our accuracy in being able to predict someone's success as a leader from these different tools. And unfortunately, the science is not perfect. We aren't at a point where we can predict with perfect accuracy. I would be a very rich woman if I could figure that out. But you can greatly, greatly improve your odds, and that's what top companies are doing. Another theme that we saw is that top companies are really integrating their assessment practices across different processes. So you can see, this chart doesn't really do it justice because you can't see the integration, and if you do download the highlights, you'll see a little bit more. But you can see that top companies are using assessment results for developing leaders, for identifying high potentials, for rewarding, for employee engagement, for a variety of purposes. What this chart really doesn't show is that they may be using the same set of assessment information for all those different purposes. In fact, while having a lot of different assessments can be a good thing, it can also be overwhelming and confusing. I talked to a company a couple of weeks ago about assessment, and they said the problem here isn't that we don't do assessment, we have too many assessments. No one knows kind of what to use for what information. They don't know which is more appropriate for selection, what's more appropriate for development, and there is a difference. There's a lot of tools out there, and some are really good for giving you self-insight, for giving you reflection, but they may have nothing to do with actually predicting performance. So what top companies do really well is they get good, solid assessment data, and then they know how to use it for multiple purposes. One of the ways that they do that is by really using competencies as the common denominator. Now, I know when you hear competencies, some people may groan. I know competencies in some organizations have been, you almost become a dirty word, so call it what you want to. Knowledge, skills, abilities, capabilities, competencies, the right stuff. What's important, I think, about competencies is that the organization is talking the same language. When they talk about 360-degree feedback, they're using one set of terminology. When they talk about their personality, they can use a common set of terminology. Working with a large transportation organization, and they've recently put in place a competency process because they want to increase their talent mobility. And they know that one of the ways they can do that is to get people across different divisions talking the same talk. And in fact, one of the key differentiators in terms of making the list of top companies at all is having core competencies in place. So what this organization is doing is that they're linking everything to that. We're going back and mapping their entry-level leadership positions, the assessments for that, to their competencies. We're linking their 360 tools to their competencies. We're linking the executive assessment processes to those competencies. So again, it really gives you a common denominator both through the course of that person's career, but when leaders have talent discussions, that's again something you've heard about today, they're speaking in a common language. So I think that's really the power of assessments. Sometimes I think people feel that competency or assessment can be at odds with diversity. I know sometimes people think, well, if we do assessment, aren't we just sort of cloning everybody? Aren't we going to be selecting everybody that's the same? And I guess I would argue that assessment can actually facilitate diversity. I would say one of my more fulfilling career moments was, it was probably about 17 years ago now. But it was an organization that was in crisis, and it was clearly in crisis. They had to reorganize, they were identifying leaders to head up different regions in the country, and they needed assessment tools put in quickly. And one of the things that came out of that process is that there were people, and more specifically I'm thinking of some female leaders, who I think they would have overlooked them. They didn't see them as having the right stuff. And by looking at objective data, I remember them now talking about, gosh, we didn't realize that that person was such a great strategic thinker. They would have overlooked people just because they didn't look the same or act the same or dress the same or whatever. So I think that assessments, being objective, can really uncover some hidden talent. So guiding principle number 5, and I think this relates a lot to the millennials and some of the things that you heard this morning from Marie, I think her name was. I'm very bad with names, which is strange for an industrial psychologist. Talking about, people want organizations where they can thrive, and it's important to have a strong value proposition. So when we talk about assessment, we usually think about it as kind of a one-way street where we're getting information about that particular participant or job candidate. But you know what? They're getting a lot of information about you from that process as well. That's probably one of the biggest changes that I've seen evolve in the area of assessment, is that there's an expectation now that assessments need to be engaging. They need to send the right kind of messages about the organization, about what the job will be like, what the values of the company are. And so, much like the good old realistic job previews that we heard about, it gives the participant a better idea of what the company's expectations are as well. So it's very important that assessment reflect those values. It's important too that folks, and this is not at all new, but it's very important that those assessments be seen as fair and impartial and as clearly job related, that they're measuring the kind of things that would be obviously important to someone who's a leader in a particular organization. High fidelity, in this age of gamification, and again, what was the term we were addicted to our technology? I don't remember what that was, but we're seeing more and more interest in assessments that really feel like games, where they're almost fun. It's almost weird to hear assessment and fun in the same sentence. It's almost like kind of people would think that's an oxymoron. But there is a more of a need that assessments be entertaining and engaging, and the participant gets something out of it. My husband is retired, and he was in the workforce, years ago, and went through a very extensive leadership assessment process. He never even got to see the results. I guess another trend that we're seeing is that that data has to be useful to the participant as well. We have one client, telecommunications client. I'm so impressed by the fact that they do leadership assessments for hiring, executives, but they give a coaching and feedback session to the individuals who aren't selected for their company in addition to the ones who are. That's an investment. They feel like that individual has taken the time to go through the assessment process, that they deserve to get some value back out of it. So one of the things that I wanted to show you just really briefly is an example of what's available today in terms of assessments. I think when you think assessment, I mean, I know a picture that comes into mind for a lot of people is, a paper pencil test, or high tech maybe is answering test questions on the computer. This is an example of a high fidelity business simulation. It happens to be one that Hewitt developed, but I think it's a good example of what transpired. So this is an organization that I'm the founder and created, called Ideasphere. It's a global innovation firm. It's fictitious. It's totally a fictitious organization. But when individuals participate in this assessment, one of the first things that they do is they get access to a website. And before the actual assessment process itself occurs, they can go into this website and see things like this, where it's almost like they're doing research on a company before they start, their first day on the job. So they'll see organizational charts, they'll see, information about press releases about the organization. I'll have to say, fun part of the job is getting to create these fictitious organizations. But you can see it's very realistic and very engaging. When participants actually get into the simulation itself, what they work with is a screen that looks like this, much like the desktop you would see in the real world. And so we're able to evaluate, how do they respond to emails? What's the tone they use? What's the priority they place on responding to certain things? But it's not just all high tech. You can still incorporate some high touch. So one of the things that with these simulations, they're getting phone calls. If an organization wants it to be a little more high touch, they could actually get a visit during that simulation. So again, the goal is to make it as realistic and lifelike as possible. And that's a plus for the candidate because they're very engaged. I mean, the reactions that we've had to these kind of multimedia assessments has really been overwhelmingly positive. And in fact, the research supports, too, that the more the assessment is multimedia, the more the participants will like it. But participants will actually say, hey, that was fun, or that was engaging, or wait, this can't be over, I have to finish one more email. So they really do get immersed in the process. One of these days, we're going to do some research on those reactions. Once in a great while, we get, or maybe not once in a while, we'll get some participants who will say, wow, that was really difficult and stressful. And then we have other participants who say, oh, that was fun, that was challenging, I love that pace. And I think there's probably something to be said just for how they're reacting even to the simulations. So the last guiding principle, which maybe is the hardest of all, and it's kind of I probably could have broken this into many guiding principles, is making sure that the process is really sustainable. And by sustainable, it's got to be practical. And you can really break this down, I think, into sort of probably should have three key words here on the page, and that would be flexible, efficient, and then scalable. Scalable isn't necessarily something you might think about, but let's talk about each of those. So flexibility. We're in a global environment, and so people can be all over the world in terms of leadership roles. It isn't necessarily always going to work to fly everybody into Chicago or New York or wherever. And so again, an assessment process that can be delivered virtually can make things much more practical. There's a time and a place for high-touch assessments, but there are many times, too, where doing it virtually can allow you to touch more people. So flexibility there. Flexibility in terms of making sure that the assessment process is couched in the competency language of the organization. Flexibility in terms of being able to use different assessment components for different groups of people. Flexibility in terms of being able to report the information out for a variety of purposes. So for example, being able to print out one report that's useful for a hiring manager and another report that's useful for onboarding and perhaps another report that's useful for the individual themselves in terms of really setting their own development plans. So again, that relates, as you can see, too, to efficiency, where you're collecting really good assessment information and you can use it for multiple purposes. The scalable part, again, that's not maybe a word you necessarily always hear about when you're talking about leadership assessment. You might hear it when you're talking about hourly and hiring huge numbers of people. But as I mentioned, top companies are really driving assessment down through all levels. So if you talk about the C-suite, you may be doing a handful of assessments, maybe more. And so, you can afford to spend quite a bit of money. Those are very, very high-stakes decisions. When you get down to the front line, you still want to do assessment, but you're talking maybe hundreds, maybe even thousands of people. And so that's where the scalability comes into play. So again, and these all overlap. Is it something you can do virtually? Is it something that's convenient for participants? That's another factor we've seen a lot of, is it convenient for participants? So can it be delivered at high volumes and that information be integrated in effective ways? Efficient. Efficient is where technology, I think, can really be a huge, huge boon. Again, as I mentioned, assessment centers have been around since the 1950s, and they continue to be one of the best approaches for assessing leaders. But they're notoriously expensive. They can be cumbersome in terms of, how do you put all that information together? You can sometimes get rooms full of assessors who need to aggregate all that data. So, enter the advent of technology, and we can have, and we do this, you could have coaches and assessors who have interacted with this person in different parts of the globe, entering data into a common system and using technology to pull all that together so that you can use your more expensive high-end assessor time to do the important stuff, like really looking at the themes or giving the feedback. So again, technology has been just a huge boon, both in terms of being able to create assessments that are more engaging and high fidelity, but also increasing the efficiency. Another example of efficiency is with assessments. One of the things we've done, and I know other organizations do too, is we have what we call a hub screen. So that if we're doing an assessment process with a group of individuals, they have kind of a one-stop shop. They can go to one place to launch their 360. They can go to the same place to, look at their personality results. They can go to the same place and maybe later take their cognitive ability test. When they have time, they can go back in and do their tutorial for the simulation. So it's not like they have to be away from work for hours and hours on end. They can do it when it's convenient. They don't have to keep track of all kinds of passwords, and it's just more convenient. So again, I think convenience for the participants would be another piece of this. So just in summary, as I mentioned, these principles are, straightforward, but as you can see, the list of top companies is short, and it's the matter of putting these practices into place on an institutional basis, doing the basics in many ways very well. So with that, I worked very hard to try to leave some time here at the end for questions. I love to get questions from the audience. A little scary too, you never know what you're going to ask me, but hopefully you'll have some questions for me. Who has questions? I know there's mics and so forth, and I'll be disappointed if I don't get any questions. You've got to challenge me somehow. There's one over here. Do we have a mic? There's one over here. Is it? The light blue jacket there.
Perhaps second to competencies on some people's hit list is 360-degree feedback. Mm-hmm. I noticed it was used by 100% of companies, and it was about number 9 on the list of validity. Now, I've got my own views about that, and obviously there's good 360 and bad 360, or well-used 360. But why do you think, in fact, in terms of validity, 360 is well down at the scale as opposed to its popularity?
So it sounds like the bottom line question is how effective is 360 based on, versus its popularity? 360 is really we've found that 360 is one of the tools that most enhances self-awareness. And so it has been very useful from that standpoint. Now, again, I'm not a believer in using 360 in isolation to make decisions because, again, 360s measure how you're perceived by other people. And I'm sure you can think of individuals who may not have had the chance to demonstrate certain behaviors. So I would never want to, evaluate someone's potential based only on a 360. But again, critical in terms of that feedback and self-awareness. I hope I answered your question. Okay, good, good. Please, more questions. We've got some other hands here.
Hi. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. Building on the same question, you had a graphic that showed it was the relationship between various tools
Right.
and performance, and I think that's what the gentleman was referring to, was that 360 was fairly low on
Okay.
that.
Yeah,
And
okay.
in fact, what I noticed, I was intrigued by, that the highest predictive validity was with cognitive abilities.
Yes.
And so I was a little surprised at that, you know, especially given the, research on emotional intelligence. I would have expected myself 360s to be higher, given that, it was more competency-based. In fact, the reference checks outdid 360s. So it was just...
Well, interesting too, the reference checks, I know there's some new techniques. So again, these are general numbers. You could have a reference checking process that's very high or very low. There's going to be a range around that. But in general, those are true. And yes, across lots of different types of positions, general intelligence is a very high predictor. But with that said, we all know people who are brilliant, who might not be the best leader. I mean, that's not all that it takes. So again, it's the multidimensional aspects of it that are important. So do I think a cognitive ability test is an important part of a leadership assessment process? Yes, absolutely. Sometimes people will ask me, well, what are you going to do if they score low? You can't, people can't learn to be intelligent. Yes and no. I've seen leaders who are a little weaker in that area, but the key is to be, again, self-aware and, surround yourself with people who are, very bright. If you're making decisions that are very high stakes under time pressure, that's a good time to get somebody else to look at your work. I'm one of those folks who, I don't know if I should say this. Math was never my favorite. I'm an industrial psychologist, so it should be. I was the last person on the last day of finals week, and it was more persistence than it was pure mental horsepower. So you can balance one thing out with another. So, but bottom line, that is a really good predictor, and I think it has a lot to do with learning agility too. You can deal with a lot of complex information, but it's not the only factor. I would never want to use that just by itself. Good questions. Keep them coming. We got 2.5 minutes left, so. Yes?
If you were to use competencies as the assessment, would you advocate using different competencies for different levels? So individual contributor, director, vice president, each have their own set? And if the answer is yes, do you have common threads between them, or are they all different?
That's a really good question, and it's a tough one to answer because, so it's sort of yes and no. I mean, I think there is a value in terms of communicating across the organization certain leadership behaviors that kind of reflect the values of the organization or reflect the unique challenges. But as I mentioned earlier, I think there are also some things that are unique to a particular level. So again, I think my answer would be both. The behaviors that you demonstrate at each of those levels might look different for different competencies. I was talking with ran into a client, and we actually helped them with their 360 tool. And so we built that where they had the same competencies, but we were very careful in defining what the behaviors looked like at each level in the organization. So I think it can be a combination. Got time for a question or two more? Anything else? Looks like there's one back in the back of the room, the white jacket, I think. We need to give you guys your running shoes.
Okay. Most companies have
Where's that coming from?
Oh, way over
Over
here.
there, sorry. Okay, thanks.
I'm not the voice from above.
Thanks.
Most companies usually have just a set core group of leadership development courses for everybody. One size fits all. You get promoted in a leadership position, you get signed on as a manager, you're all going to go through that whether you like it or not. Do you find that the best companies actually are steering away from that now and you're using assessments to customize training for leadership and identify the leadership tools they really need?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I guess what I was hearing are organizations, and I'm sorry, it's a little fuzzy through the mics, but what I was hearing is that our organizations using that assessment information to then customize the leadership development process. Yes, absolutely. You know, many of the leadership development programs that I've been involved in, a leadership capability assessment for that level is the first step in the process. And then development planning comes after that. Now, do we completely tailor every course? I mean, that would sort of be impossible because each group member is going to have some different needs. But we do use that information to determine what are the areas that you need to focus on. We've had clients too where they take that information and they'll modify the program in terms of certain activities that they build in, add, change. I think one of the things I've observed is that leadership development programs have become much more fluid in terms of sort of making some parts of the program up as they go along because of what the class needs are. Another thing that I heard in some of the leadership interviews that I did for Top Companies for Leaders was more individualized focus. So there might be some things that are group level, but some things that are very individual in terms of assignments that they pick to go, do a field trip that's very specific to what they need to learn versus the whole group doing that certain thing. So I don't know that we've mastered it yet, but I think that will be one of the trends in my prediction that we'll see is more and more opportunities to combine individualized development with still those opportunities to work in groups and learn from each other. Okay, well, 0-0, I am done, and that means you're even closer to the handcrafted cocktails, so you can see where mine is. Thank you very much for all the questions. You're a great audience.